Greetings and welcome to the internet world. If and once you arrive here, why don't you go ahead and let us know that you're here. Welcome to Jerry. Glad you've joined us. If you just let me know if you can hear me a-okay. Dana Booth, welcome to you guys. Pat Lair. Yes, Jerry says we can hear you. All right, good. We're going to give folks a couple of minutes to jump in and join us here. We'll make sure that we've got enough folks who are here as we get going. Hi to Doreen. Welcome to Phil and Ruth. Glad to have you guys here with us. Pat, thanks for the update on the sound. It's always good to know that people can hear. Becky, welcome. Glad to have you. For those of you this morning, we did have some issues with our live stream, but we think we're going to get that all figured out, but appreciate your patience with that. Do apologize if you missed out on things this morning. We did have, let me get this here, I had a couple people ask about what attendance was like this morning, and I've got that here. So we had 27 people at the first service, and we had 50 people at the second service this morning again, so just if you're interested, we had 27 people at the first service and 50 people at the second service this morning. We will give another few seconds as folks jump in here, give them a chance to join us, and then we're going to get started with a brand new class series. We're going to be starting here on our, at least for a little bit, Sunday night classes. We're showing our versatility and our ability to do classes, whether it be at 9:30 in the morning like normal, or we can even do 5 o'clock at night. So aren't we so flexible and versatile? I do want to say happy Mother's Day to all of the mothers out there. I hope that it's been a good day for all of you. I know that for many mothers, this is a very different Mother's Day than you are used to. We've got the Mosses here, and Bruce Blackadder has joined us. So we'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to start with a intentionally very vague question, and we will, I think its vagueness is a part of the point of the question. So if it sounds vague, it's supposed to be. So the question I want you to type in and share your comments on is, what is the best way to learn something? So go ahead and use your comment feature answering this intentionally very vague question, what is the best way to learn something? So using comments, the best way to learn something. How would you answer that question? What kind of thoughts, ideas, or suggestions would you have for what is the best way to learn something? Okay, Doreen says, by doing it. Becky says similar sort of thing to do. We're navigating the broad question. Jerry says by teaching it. Rhonda says by repetition. Gay says to live it. Andy again with this notion of to do it. Renee says to study. Now I think that Pat says by example. Having something to follow, to study, to read more about it, books, etc. Phil and Ruth mentioned this concept again of repetition. Eric is mentioning having someone that would train you in that field. My answer is that it depends on what that something is, because the kind of thing we're trying to learn depends dramatically on the content of what it is we're trying to learn. So, for example, see if anybody would have a similar or a different answer to this question. What is the best way to learn to ride a bike? So now we're taking the general, what's the best way to learn something, and now we're going to look at some very specific things. So use your comment feature and let me know, what do you think is the best way to learn to ride a bike? The Mosses maybe should chime in here. I hear there's been some exciting bike news going on in the Moss household, but I won't speak before they choose to speak or to address that. Okay, yes, Jerry says that Jacob Moss can tell us, so we need to see if Jacob will share with us. What is the best way to learn to ride a bike? Again, as you guys leave comments, I'm 15-ish to 20 seconds behind as I get comments. That Gay mentions there, that's this concept of practice. Renee says training wheels. Jerry, practice, and if you fall off, get back on, which likely there will be somewhere along the way. When I learned to ride a bike, it was on the bike with usually either my mom or my dad holding the holding the seat, kind of keeping it balanced, which I did inevitably learn to do that. Phil and Ruth mentioned practice crashing. Maybe that's why Jerry crashed as she went down the hill. I'm not entirely sure about that. Take the pedals off. That's what Jerry says. So when we taught our kids to ride a bike, we went ahead and did the whole YouTube thing, which was getting a theory or a system that we thought might be helpful and then getting the kids to practice. So we kind of combined two different disciplines. One is find the best way to do it, and then you begin to practice it. So what we did was we took off the pedals, and so the kids can put their feet down and they can balance there. Okay, Jacob says, getting my balance first without training wheels, just balancing and then putting my feet on the pedals. And unfortunately, I'm on this iPad that doesn't, oh, there we go. And then it took off. So Jacob, it was kind of working on that balance piece and that balance aspect of it. So depending on what we're trying to teach, it's going to require a very different kind of teaching. Judy says he mentions that he means without any help. He didn't have any actual training wheels on his bike. Now, here's the next thing. How do you learn not to shake someone's hand when you go to church? Okay, so that's a discipline. Several of us had to learn to practice because we're very accustomed to when we come into church, you see someone and you extend a hand to shake a hand. So how do we learn not to shake someone's hand when we're accustomed to doing that? So what do you think might be the way of learning that? Would that be the exact same as you would learn to ride a bike, or do you think learning it would be a different approach or a different strategy? And I think that as we look at that question, not shaking someone's hand, that would have to be you learn by, Dan mentions this notion of deliberate thought. You may just be rehearsing, something like don't shake, don't shake, don't shake. Jerry mentions replacing it with a different practice. So we're not going to shake, but somehow I am going to greet you, or somehow I'm going to encounter you. So I'm going to give a little bit of a forethought to what I may do instead of or in place of that practice. But how we learn, that is different. It probably wouldn't be very useful or helpful to go to a class to learn something like that. Jerry says, yeah, put your hands in your pocket and maybe even put some duct tape on them and get that taken care of. And then maybe this last one, and again, we're just kind of trying to illustrate what is the best way to learn something. It depends on what that something is. What is the best way to learn how to do a quadratic equation? I don't even know what a quadratic equation is. Apparently, at some point in my life, I learned that. But what do you think is the best way to learn and I don't even know I think there are multiple quadratic equations. Someone can correct me on this if I'm wrong, or maybe there is only a single quadratic equation. I think a quadratic equation is a type. So Becky says, yeah, how are you going to learn to do it? You're going to cheat, all right? Other ways, how are you going to learn to do a quadratic equation? Practice. That Dan mentions a practice, which if you've when you fail, you keep trying. You need to have a structure of something. Okay, Gay says, ask Art Booth. Bruce is going to try and fail again. That's how Bruce is going to just do the same thing every way. We're going to build up to it. Jeff's mentioning breaking practices that are accepted by most everyone and considered normal is extremely hard. Yeah, so what we're learning there requires something very different. I would assume if you're going to learn a quadratic equation, you're going to need somebody who knows how to do it. They're going to need to sit you down, and there's going to be a whiteboard, and there's going to be homework, and there's going to be all of this sort of thing, but you need somebody who has mastered that sort of aspect. Now, I ask all of that to just kind of set the table for life as a Christian, which is the question we're going to be looking at is, what is the best way to learn to be a disciple of Jesus? There was a guy who wrote a book in 1977, John Westerhoff III, and the title of the book was called Will Our Children Have Faith? And basically, I mean, this is kind of a crude synopsis, but basically he said, the model that the church has used to teach discipleship is not a model that's compatible for the kind of learning that we need to do when it comes to following our life with Jesus. And so, maybe let's start with that question then, right? What's the best way to learn to be a disciple of Jesus? So we've talked about learning to ride a bike. We've talked about learning not to shake hands. We've talked about learning the quadratic equation. But if you think about being a disciple of Jesus, what do you think are some, either the best ways or some of the things that would need to be involved, elements that you would need to learn in order to be a disciple of Jesus? So we're looking at this question of John Westerhoff III. Will our children have faith? What model does the church use? And what might be the best model for teaching discipleship? So if you have any thoughts about that, what are some of the models, ways or approaches to learning to be a disciple of Jesus? Dan says learning from our failures, learning from others also, Dan mentions. Okay, to walk in the footsteps of the Master. Richard and Leanne mentioned staying in the Word, having that relationship with or that submitting oneself to God's instruction through His Word. Any other thoughts in terms of what's the best way to learn to be a disciple of Jesus? I had intentionally set this class up to be a little bit more interactive, and I know that delays what we're doing, but it just feels a little bit more like how a class should. Jerry mentions to emulate His ways. Becky, very similar, imitating Jesus. Rhonda talks about this aspect or this notion of putting others first. So this book by John Westerhoff, he says that the church has embraced a school instructional paradigm. In other words, we've decided that the best way to produce faith in God, discipleship of Jesus, is by borrowing from schools the way that they teach things like multiplication, which would involve us doing things like a Sunday school, and it would have a desk, and it would have a chair, it would have resources, material, all of that sort of thing that you would try to teach. And the question is that the best model for us to teach discipleship? Certainly that should be an aspect, a piece of that. But as other people are mentioning, knowing what Jesus would do is a part of how we teach discipleship. Renee mentions the importance of serving others. Phil and Ruth mention imitating others who are disciples, that we have something bigger, or we need something bigger than just a school instructional paradigm when it comes to learning this thing about discipleship. I think there's some limitations when we approach the whole of spiritual formation, discipleship, when we approach the whole thing from this kind of school approach. And for the sake of time, I'll just give you those. We've got some other things that I'll have some comments on, but I think that God is easily reduced to an object to be studied rather than an individual to be enjoyed. The school instructional paradigm, that's great for studying objects or kind of inanimate things. But imagine if, for example, you were to get to know your best friend or your spouse using a school instructional model, where you go sit down at a desk and you say, okay, I'm going to take notes while you tell me what you like, what you're interested in, and all of those sort of things. It just doesn't translate in the same way. And so that's why, as Phil and Ruth mentioned, like Paul says, imitate me as I imitate Christ. This need for seeing a incarnational, a tangible model, and then beginning to practice that. And as Dorian mentions, that the Bible says to walk as Jesus walked, which involves this action or this activity. I think that another limitation of the kind of the schooling approach is that it prioritizes thinking over doing. It's really easy for people to get the sense that as long as I get the right answer when somebody asks the question, then that's what discipleship entails. That the discipleship is kind of when Jesus gives a pop quiz, as long as we can get the right answer, we're good, we're set. But I think that as we look at that, we say, no, I mean, discipleship is more than just developing the right answers. It's more than just thinking the right answers. It's actually about doing, practicing and living that which is right. I think the other limitation of the school model is that it segments life with God. That we somehow say, like, when we come to church, this is when we're going to learn about God, learn about discipleship, but then when we're around the kitchen table, this is no longer kind of Christian curriculum time. And I think that's, as Dan mentioned, the best way to teach our children is to be the model we want them to follow, which means that instructional piece is going to happen, as Deuteronomy 6 says, when you walk about, that it's this all of life instruction. Judy mentions how this teaching, it would be it's living and it's breathing life that's fully absorbed in every action. It penetrates and it touches every piece of our lives. Dorian mentions that there's this Buddhist proverb: I hear, I forget, I see, I remember, I do, I understand. That all of this, I think that we're recognizing is that discipleship is moving towards this kind of practice, this certain way of living. A.W. Tozer once said, the whole transaction of Christian conversion has been made mechanical and spiritless. We've almost forgotten that God is a person, and as such can be cultivated as any person can. I'm going to read that again because it's pretty wordy. The whole transaction of religious conversion has been made mechanical and spiritless. That's the problem with the instructional approach. The school instruction paradigm is it can make things mechanical and spiritless. So if you approach the quadratic equation, you might learn it, but you certainly wouldn't be passionate about it. And then Tozer goes on to say, we've almost forgot that God is a person, and as such can be cultivated as any person can. In other words, we would get to know God in the same way that we get to know any other person. So we have some models in our culture for getting to know people. Say specifically, if you look at our culture, how does one get to know somebody they might be interested in marrying? We have this model of dating. Dating is where you go and you spend time together and you do things together. That model we think is the best model, or some people do. That model is a model to get to know someone that's probably better than, again, text me your social security number, text me your favorite color, and text me your favorite kind of food. I mean, that model doesn't facilitate really getting to know someone. It facilitates learning information and learning facts. And so as Bruce mentions this concept, the right answers are elusive to us. And so as you think about Jesus, how does Jesus teach discipleship? So think about Jesus as our model. So we've talked a lot about model. We've talked a lot about imitation. But think about Jesus and think about how was it that he went about teaching his disciples how to be disciples. So use your comment feature as you look at Jesus' model or his method for teaching discipleship. What did that look like? What did it involve? And what did it entail? So how did Jesus approach the process of teaching his disciples how to be followers of him? Use the comment feature and share some of your thoughts on how Jesus taught his disciples to be disciples. Jeff Lair thinks he's going to get bonus points by using the word parables because I taught about parables this morning. Jerry also is using parables. Boy, you guys were well primed for that one this morning. Dan, he taught by example and then explaining what happened. Jerry mentions lots of time together. Lori walking alongside of them in this kind of this daily rhythmic thing. He sent them out to practice and fail. Bruce, he loves practicing and fail. Bruce, I hope you practice more than you fail, but certainly that sometimes is the only way to do it, is you get out and you just simply make an effort or an attempt at that thing. I had three things on my list of how Jesus teaches his disciples. One is, the first is I think he modeled a transparent relationship with his Father. So there's something about the disciples that when they look at Jesus, they say he has a unique relationship with the Father. I think that comes out whenever he prays and they say, Lord, teach us to pray. And that's because they recognize in how Jesus interacts with the Father, there's something qualitatively different about it. And so that kind of, that emphasizes kind of what Cliff mentions, demonstrated and then asked them to follow. So as we look at this demonstration piece, it is a demonstration and it's simultaneously not a demonstration. That it's this lifestyle that he lived in relationship with the Father that he allowed the disciples to see, and then they would inquire about why do you do this? What's this practice? Or this understanding that Jesus has a unique relationship with the Father, and it created this curiosity in the disciples to want to say, what is different about how you relate to the Father? The second thing is you have these daily interactions. This discipleship was not taught just in the sphere of the sacred, but it was discipleship in the sacred and in the everyday normal. So that's, as we talked about parables this morning, you have the ordinariness of parables. If we think that discipleship education can only happen in a religious sphere, we're going to miss out on so much of what God is trying to teach us. That we learn about discipleship in the marketplace and we learn about discipleship in the church. We learn about discipleship at work and we learn about discipleship in our group Bible study. And so what you see Jesus doing is he's taking just everything he's observing around him and saying, here is a lesson of discipleship that we can find in that. And then the other thing that I think, and this is going to be kind of the key that we focus on here, is that Jesus also, he teaches these formative practices. Jesus doesn't say, I just want you to think new things. Jesus wants, in the wise words of Bruce Blackadder, them to try and, if necessary, fail. But he certainly wants them to engage in the trying aspect. That he doesn't want them to just kind of go away and say, oh, Jesus, that was a great idea you had there. Or that was a great thought you had there, or that was a great notion you had there. But what he wants them to do is to begin to practice, to actually do the things that he's teaching. And I think that Jesus believes that when we do what he's teaching, we become something that we need to become, that we wouldn't if we just thought about it. So one could say, I would likely lose a little bit more weight if I did not eat chocolate cake, but unless I don't actually eat chocolate cake, I'm not going to be transformed. And it seems common, I guess, maybe that's going a little far, but it's not unusual for us to spend a lot of our time in class settings talking about these great ideas that if they were to be practiced, they would be really, really great, that somehow we just choose not to practice. Discipleship is the act of practicing what Jesus has called us to practice. So Phil and Ruth mentioned that when Jesus asked his disciples to follow him, they left everything and followed him. It's not I'm going to teach you a new way of thinking or a new doctrine or a new concept. It's I'm going to teach you a new way of living. And so in that new way of living, they do get new concepts, they do get new thinking, they do get new doctrines, but those facilitate the kind of living that he's trying to engage in them. So this is a question I want some feedback on, which is, what's the best way to develop a relationship with someone? So you can talk about this in the sphere of relationship to God if you want, or you can just think about it in relationship to someone else. What's some of the best ways to develop a relationship with someone? Okay, so we're not looking at studying the quadratic equation. We're looking at, how do I get to know you as a person? So use the comment feature and share some of the things you think are helpful as we try to develop relationships with people. Okay, so Jeff mentions this aspect of getting to know them. And Jeff, when you have a minute, go ahead and flesh that out. I mean, how would you get to know them? What kinds of things would you do to get to know them? Would you ask them to write a book that you're going to read about them? Dorian mentions you spend time together. Dan, to want has to be first and then spending time with them. Like, if I don't really want to get to know you, it's going to require an investment. And I'm not going to invest in trying to get to know you if I just plain don't even want to. I'm not interested in that. Jerry mentions learning their love language. We were talking about that in our family this morning. Different people hear I love you in different ways. Mark, oh man, we got lots of comments coming here. Mark is to work on something with them. Yeah, you do a project together. Shayla, take a trip with them. Rhonda, you talk and listen together. Jerry mentions that you get to know them, you ask questions, you find similar interests. Cliff mentions finding something in common to discuss, and you engage in this conversation. So Jeff's following up now by spending quality time together, even by working alongside together. And so I think all of these are in the ballpark of, okay, so Judy mentions communicating people in letters. You speak, you share, you get to know them through that. Eric is mentioning you have a meal together. To be quarantined with them, that's a great way to get to know someone. Yeah, we don't have a preconceived notion about who we think that they are, but we just certainly we spend time getting to know them. I had 3 words that I think that to me kind of summarizes the best way to develop a relationship with someone is my 3 words, and they all start with E. So, I mean, bonus points for the preacher here. Okay, number 1 is encounter, number 2 is engagement, and number 3 is experience. You have to encounter them, you have to be engaged with them, and you have to have an experience or experiences with them. You have to do things together. As I use the word experience, I'm not talking about like having a certain kind of feeling, but you collectively experience life together. You do something in life together. And so again, as we're thinking about getting to know God, we're thinking about discipleship, I think it's important to know, in what ways am I engaging with God or Christ? In what ways am I experiencing God and or Christ? And in what ways am I encountering God and or Christ? So I want us to look at a text in John chapter 4. And I think this kind of helps us to begin to think through what this looks like to encounter, to engage, and to experience. Of course, Jesus is in John 4 having a conversation with the woman, the Samaritan woman at the well there. And she begins to get a sense of who Jesus is, right? She says in chapter 4, verse 19, I see that you are a prophet. So if you think about getting to know people, it always starts wider and it gets narrower and narrower and narrower until you figure, okay, this I think is who you are. Have you ever gotten to know someone and you're like, when I first met you, I thought you were this, but then I realized that you're over here. That this happens in the frame of coming to know people through the conversation that this woman is having with Jesus. She is coming to know who he is. Is he a prophet? She thinks he is, and the answer is kind of, sort of, but he's a prophet, but he's also more. Now, as the conversation, the dialogue continues, eventually the woman is convinced that Jesus is this Messiah that he reveals himself to be. And so in John chapter 4, verse 28, then the woman left her water jar and went back to the city, and she said to the people, come and see a man who told me everything I have ever done. He cannot be the Messiah, can he? They left the city and were on their way to him. Notice that the woman has had this encounter, she's had an engagement, and she's had an experience with Jesus. And when she goes and she tells the other people from the village to come, basically what she says is, you need to come and experience him yourself. You need to come and be engaged with him yourself. You need to come and have an encounter yourself. So her exact words is, come and see. Now, if we were looking through John's gospel, we might scratch our heads and say, that sounds kind of a little bit familiar. In John chapter 1, verse 38, when Jesus turned and saw them, that being John and 2 of his disciples, he said to them, what are you looking for? And they said to him, Rabbi, which means teacher, where are you staying? And he said to them, come and see. They came and saw where he was staying, and they remained with him that day. It was about 4:00 in the afternoon. I think the text is using this, as John often does. There's these layers of things that Jesus is communicating. When he's saying, come and see, it's not just, we want to know where you're going, so we want to come and see the house that you're staying. But instead, what Jesus is doing is he's inviting them to come and begin to experience life with him. To be engaged with him in this life that they're doing together. It's a similar thing in John 1:46. Nathanael said to him, can anything good come out of Nazareth? And Philip said to him, what? Come and see. When Jesus saw Nathanael coming towards him, he said, here is truly an Israelite in whom there is no deceit. What Nathanael is surprised at is that Jesus already knows him, even though he's coming out to now see and to know him. And so what the woman does is the exact same thing that we've been seeing Philip has done, Jesus has done, which is saying, hey, if you want to get to know someone, to really know them, it's not here, I'm gonna give you the 5 books you have to read about Jesus, but it's this notion of come and see. There needs to be an experience, there needs to be engagement, and there needs to be an encounter so a person can say, I truly know him, which I think is what happens in the latter part, coming back now to John 4. Beginning in verse 39. Many Samaritans from that city believed in him because of the woman's testimony. So that belief begins. They have not yet themselves come and seen. They have not yet encountered or engaged, had the experience of meeting Jesus, but yet they've believed. So there has been this transformation that has begun based on the woman's testimony, verse 40 then says, so when the Samaritans came to him, they asked him to stay with them, and he stayed there 2 days. And many more believed because of his word, that now being Jesus's. And they said to the woman, it is no longer because of what you said we believe, for we have heard for ourselves, and we know that this is truly the Savior of the world. Something changed in the encounter. It deepened. It didn't go down a different track, but it deepened whenever Jesus came for 2 days and they spent that time with him. That engagement, that encounter, that experience with Jesus was significant in terms of their discipleship formation. And the reason why I want to do this class that we're looking at is we're going to be looking at walking with God. And we're going to specifically be exploring different practices. And the reason why I think this is a great time to do a class like this is because we're having less of this format, kind of classroom. We're going to go to a church building. We're going to learn things of God, which means theoretically, may not be always the case, but at least theoretically means there may be more opportunities to begin to practice the kinds of things that we're learning in our classes. So this aspect of come and see, this encounter, this experience, this engagement, that we would have opportunities in our week to really focus on that, because we've lost the classroom and now life becomes the classroom. Your home is the classroom, and these all become venues or areas where we can begin to explore life with God and the kind of things that God's trying to teach us in the everyday aspects and elements of life. And so what we're going to do in this series about life with God is we're going to introduce different practices and encourage you to actually go out and practice sometime those events. And so the practices, Christian practices, are ongoing concrete practices that over time enable us to engage with God and submit to his active presence in the world. I'm going to read that again. These are ongoing concrete practices. So we're going to be looking at concrete practices, which are not just like, love someone. That's not concrete enough for what we're trying to talk about. We're going to be looking at concrete practices that over time, which means the very first time you do it, you may, Bruce Blackadder say it, you may fail. Okay, the very first time you may fail, and that's okay. But what we're looking at is concrete practices that over time, these are practices to be repeated. They will then enable us to engage with God and submit to his active presence in this world. So they have this purpose and this direction. And it's this recognition and this belief that the best way to learn discipleship is by doing discipleship, is by engaging in things, and it is in the very act of engaging that God's formation and transformation happens in our midst. So there's 2 acronyms that we could choose to use, and it depends on the first class or the second class will be thing. But maybe the easiest way to remember is IRS. Can everybody remember the IRS? IRS, which means each class what we're going to do is we're going to introduce a new spiritual practice, the why of a practice. Then we are going to do a rewirement, and I'll explain what rewirements are in a minute. We're going to do a rewirement, which is going to introduce what practice we're going to be looking at. And then the S is share. We're going to report back. Now, that may be the most difficult aspect for us to pull off on an online class. How do we report back? But we are going to learn how to do that. We're going to explore how to do that. And Bruce, we may try and we may fail along the way, but we are going to keep on trying to find a good way that we can report back. So each of our classes, as we go forward with these series, we're going to introduce a Christian spiritual practice. We are going to give some rewirements, which is some specific things that we're going to do. And then we're going to give opportunities to report back. What did you learn? We're going to share about the experience. We're going to share about what that engagement was like, and give that formula. So in this class, we're going to simply just introduce the introduction, why introduce something, what rewirements are, and why it's important to share our experiences just as we introduce this new series that we're getting into. We're going to introduce a practice every time. And the reason is because sometimes we need to confront the gap between what we believe and what we practice. Sometimes there's a gap between what we know we ought to do, and I'm not just talking simply about sin here. I'm not saying, sometimes I know I shouldn't do that and I do that. There are good things that we know we should do that we don't. I guess let's go ahead and just share some reasons. Why do you think that there are good things that we know we probably should do that we do not do? So discipleship, there are certain things where it's not like, oh, I just need to tell you to do this because I already know that I should probably be doing that, but I'm simply not. What are some of the reasons why, use your comment feature, why we might not do the good things that we know we probably ought to be doing or we probably should be doing as Christians? So what are some of the reasons that we have this gap between what we know and between what we practice? All right, Lori mentions the time constraints. Yeah. Bruce, some things are hard to do. They just simply are difficult. Fear, Doreen is mentioning the fear that we experience. I'm going to write some of these things down. Don't even know if I remember how to write. It's been so long that I've actually used that. Okay, the inconvenience of it. Jerry mentions that. Phil and Ruth, we're afraid of what someone might think of us. Yeah, Dan, it takes us out of our comfort zone. Jerry mentions that we're intimidated. I find it interesting for those of you who were part of our services this morning, if I say specifically of the first service, if I had one word to describe it, Jerry mentions our priorities might be off. We think our way is better. If I had one word to describe this morning, it would be somewhere between weird and awkward. So, sorry if that's not the best overall review. It's just different, right? Like, you come in, I can't shake your hand, we're going to talk to each other, but I want to make sure I'm keeping distance, and then we all have our masks on, and we just feel, it feels so different. By the second service, I felt like I was getting my rhythm a little bit. Here's my mask that I wore this morning. If you didn't have a chance to see me in my mask, you can now enjoy. This is what it would have been like to see that. But these things these practices that we do, they all get easier over time if we do engage in them. Christina mentions, that we're not good at the action. It's not our strength. And so sometimes we just, we bypass it simply because it's not. And I wonder if somewhere at the base of all of this has something to do with impatience. This process of becoming disciples of Jesus is not an instantaneous thing, and it is an over and over and over and over again thing as we are being formed into the likeness of Christ. But so each week we're going to introduce something, and one of the things that we're doing is we're introducing we're kind of dealing with this gap between what we know in our heads and what we practice. Like, I know that's a good thing, but I'm choosing not to practice that. And why is that? And sometimes there's a disconnect, I think. We know that in our heads we should be doing something, but we just don't feel the passion to go about doing that. Sometimes the practices that Jesus is introducing us to, we just think, you know what, that's actually not going to really do anything, or it's not going to really get me anywhere that I think that I need to get in life, or some of those. So sometimes we might need to be convinced in our heads, this is why this is an important thing for us to practice. I'm thinking of Psalm 1, where Psalm 1 begins by saying, happy are those who do not follow the advice of the wicked, or take the path that sinners tread, or sit in the seat of scoffers, but their delight is in the law of the Lord, and on it they meditate day and night. Sometimes we get the impression that those who are happy are in fact those who are doing the wicked, or those who are treading that pathway, or those who are sitting in the seat of scoffers. And so we sometimes need to just step back at that enough to say, does that practice produce the kind of righteous life, not only that God wants us to have, but that we also want to have? I think that we'll see that these practices, as they form us into certain kinds of people, it's not just that we do them because then God's going to be happy with us doing it. It's because we realize that by practicing them, we actually do come to have, say in the language of John 10:10, this life in abundance, this life in its fullness. And so as we introduce it, one of the things that we're doing is we will be kind of addressing some of those mental hurdles. Because there are certain things that we believe about God that we're also not willing to practice because we're afraid it's going to get us somewhere we don't really want to go. I think an example of that is Jonah. Jonah had an orthodox belief in God. He believed that God was gracious and compassionate, abounding in loving kindness, slow to anger, and Jonah, as a result of that, decided not to practice Christian testimony. So he didn't start off with a bad kind of theology or bad doctrine. He had a good doctrine that he misapplied, and because of that, he refused to practice what God wanted him to practice. So sometimes we just need to step back enough to think and to kind of ask some questions about, okay, is this an appropriate practice for me? And then we may need to get there. And so we're going to get clarity by every week. We're going to introduce a practice and what might be the benefit and the value of that practice, so that we make sure that at the very least our hearts are convinced, but we're not just wanting to convince our heads, but we're not just wanting to convince our heads, we also want to convince our hearts that this is something we should long for. This is something we should desire. This is something that in fact will bring about the righteousness that God desires and that we also desire in our lives. So after the introduction of each class, we're going to do a rewirement. And I think I mentioned this on Sunday morning. I've stolen this idea from Laurie Santos, who's doing a class called The Science of Well-Being. And in her class, she does these lectures on things that make people happy or things that people think make them happy. And then every week she has rewirements. So these are actions you have to engage in order to kind of do the kinds of things that the class is talking about. And I think that as Christians, that's the piece that we most often, unfortunately, I think we miss and neglect. I think I've mentioned before in a sermon that Buddhism is currently one of the fastest growing religions, quote unquote, in America. And the reason that it appeals to people, especially this piece of mindfulness and this piece of stillness and meditation. And people are saying Buddhism is a way of living, but Christianity is a way of thinking. And so what people are saying is, I need resources to live this in this world, not just like thoughts that help me. But I think that means that we've somehow mispresented Christianity if people think Christianity is about a kind of thinking and Buddhism is about a kind of living. Because Christianity fundamentally is about what? A kind of living. That as you look at Jesus' teachings, he's often not teaching just to say, here's a new doctrine I want you to kind of get your mind around. He's saying, here's a new practice I want you to begin to live and to practice. And so we need these rewirements, these practices that might rewire our bad habits or might rewire us in terms of to be the kinds of humans that God wants us to be, that lead to the flourishing, to the blessing of other people. I think that one of the things that we find with Satan, as we looked at the temptations in our sermon series there, is he just wants to alter the pathway that we take. God's pathways typically are more difficult. They are slower, but they're important what kind of pathways we walk on. And so we have to be wired into the kind of people who follow Jesus. So grab in your Bibles, Matthew chapter 5. And I want us to find there, and you can use your comment feature, and I know this might take a minute. Hopefully it'll work. We'll see. What are some of the practices that Jesus prescribes in the Sermon on the Mount? Again, starting around verse 21 and following. Jesus is introducing a new way of thinking about the law, a new way of understanding the law, but he's also simultaneously introducing new practices. Here's things that you should begin doing. So in this section, find some of the practices that Jesus teaches in the Sermon on the Mount, and go ahead and use the comment feature and share some of those things that you discover. What are some of the practices that Jesus prescribes? That this is something that you ought to be doing, or this is something that you should be doing, that by engaging in these practices, you actually become the kind of person who honors God in this area. So just look through the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5, beginning of verse 25 or 21, and what are some of the practices, the actions that Jesus prescribes, saying, here's something that you should do. Okay, so Doreen mentions this concept of loving your enemy. Now, okay, so Jesus says, you have heard that it was said, this is verse 43, that you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. So the active practice that Jesus is prescribing here is the practice of beginning to pray for those who persecute you. So loving your neighbor might be so broad and so general that you say, I don't even know how to begin doing that. And Jesus says, here's a practice. And what is that practice? You pray for those who persecute you. That in that action, and then he later will mention treatment of tax collectors. He will mention if you greet only your brothers and sisters. So Jesus' prescription, in addition to praying for those who persecute you, his prescription is to greet people who are not just your brothers and sisters. So a person who seeks to live out this kingdom principle in their lives would begin to practice two things at the very least. Number one, I'm going to start praying for my enemies. And number two, I'm going to greet people who are not part of my family or my body, or might be people who I'd ordinarily not greet. So again, this love of neighbor is this larger kind of concept that can almost have no flesh and bones on it. You can say love your neighbor, and your neighbor is so broad and wide and mushy that it's like, I don't know how to do that. But pray for those who persecute you. Greet those who you ordinarily wouldn't greet. These become small practices that enable us to love our neighbor. Okay, so Jerry mentions also getting right with someone that you reconcile with them. So verse 23 of Matthew 5 says, so when you're offering your gift at the altar and you remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go first be reconciled to your brother or sister, then come offer your gift. When's the last time that you called someone, that you visited someone, that you apologized to someone and said, look, I know things have been weird between us. I'm either aware or I'm unaware of what caused that, but I just want to be reconciled with you. So Jesus, again, he's not trying to create a new way of thinking about relationships. He's trying to create a new way of being in relationship. There's a practice that he prescribes. Dan mentioning also this notion of settling matters quickly, which you find this practice there. And so each week what we're going to find is there's these rewirements. There's these things that Jesus is saying, if you begin to build these small things, it's going to lead to something that is the ultimate end or the ultimate goal. but it begins by learning to practice these small things again, not just by thinking new things, which I think is the unfortunate part of our church model right now, which is we can read and preach this and we can agree with it, but how often do we actually go out and we begin to do that? And then the third piece, so the IRS, we're going to introduce a practice. We're going to introduce a concept. We're going to introduce then a practice through a rewirement. We're going to try to rewire things so that we are wired as disciples should be and ought to be. And the last thing we're going to do is we're going to share our experiences. There's something I think important that happens in the process of formation by sharing about what we're experiencing. I think of Matthew 8:27 through 30. Jesus went on with his disciples to the village of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" They answered him, "John the Baptist, and others Elijah, and others one of the prophets." Now, how would they know who people say that Jesus is? I think that the answer would have to be they've been in conversation with people about Jesus. So what do you make of him? Do you think he's a prophet? Do you think he's something more? Oh, I think he's Elijah. That they're conversing with one another about what they're experiencing in discipleship with Jesus. And it's in that rich conversation and sharing of experiences that you begin to realize that there's some value in this conversation and in this discussion. We mentioned that relationships are about experience, they're about engagement, and they're about encounter. And I think as we engage and experience and encounter one another in doing these practices, that simultaneously is a part of the way that we engage in and encounter God. So as I say, I went out and I started doing this practice, and here was my experience of it, that we may come to find something valuable in a practice that we ourselves might not have personally seen or experienced with it. And so we want to process it with a community where we can even say, yeah, that's true, but this is also true. So our introduction is now complete to our first class, Walking with God, where each week what we're going to do is we're going to introduce a Christian practice. We are going to describe how it's going to rewire us. And then you're supposed to go out and do it. I'm going to repeat that. You're supposed to go out and do it, and I'm supposed to go out and do it. And then we're going to share our experiences. We're going to have to figure out exactly how we do that, but we want to be able to do that. So that's what I have for class tonight. If there's any questions or comments, we can take that, and we'll deal with those. I'm just trying to think. I feel like I had one announcement I wanted to make, but I'm not sure I remember. So if I'm forgetting something, somebody can use the comment feature there. But any concluding questions, comments, statements, we will be continuing, at least for next week. We'll see what the schedule looks like after that meeting for a class at 5 p.m. And we'll be looking at learning to walk with God, discipleship as an embodied practice, not just a mental exercise. In light of the fact that I'm not seeing any comments or any questions, I will bid thee farewell, my beloved. I hope you guys have a wonderful evening tonight. Bruce mentions Larry's mother passed away yesterday. Would that be Larry Hibble? I know he's asked us to pray for his mom. I'm going to just wait and we'll get confirmation from Bruce on which Larry. I'm assuming that's correct. Rich and Leanne, thanks for coming. We're glad that we had you guys here with us. Yes, okay. So, yeah, prayers for Larry Hibble's family with Larry's mom's passing. Hope everybody has a great evening. Enjoy your Mother's Day. If you have not yet called your moms, make sure you do that. I'm sure they would appreciate that. God bless you guys and have a wonderful night. Thanks, everyone.